Program Manager at the National Committee on North Korea. Thank you so much for joining our program today on Pyongyang and Moscow relations. For those of you who are new to our organization, NCNK is an NGO working to promote principled engagement between the US and North Korea in order to promote peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and to improve the lives of the North Korean people. For some time now, we've partnered with the East-West Center in Washington to develop the North Korea in the World website to provide an overview of North Korea's external relations. This webinar series has been a natural outgrowth of this database where we've taken the opportunity to engage with specialists to explore North Korea's bilateral relations in more depth. And we're so pleased to have this conversation with Anthony Rinna on Moscow and Pyongyang relations. We're nearing the end of this webinar series where we focused on North Korea's relationship with European countries. And I would encourage you to check out our YouTube page to view past programs if you'd like to learn more. With that, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Ross Tokala from the East-West Center, who will moderate today's discussion. Ross is the Executive Associate to the Director at the East-West Center in Washington. And in that capacity, he gives advice and support to the Director on strategic projects and programs and helps to monitor progress and ensure effective coordination with staff and stakeholders. He previously worked at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and at the US embassies both in South Korea and the United Kingdom. And for his fuller bio, we'll post a link below. So with that, I'd like to toss it over to Ross. Thanks so much, Ross.
Esther, thank you. And on behalf of the East-West Center, thank you again for our partnership on the North Korea in the World project and on the North Korea in the World webinar series. So always a pleasure. And I do encourage everyone who has joined us to look at the website and to look at past webinars and publications. So thank you all for joining us. To give you a sense of the format for today, we will start with me giving a brief bio of Anthony, and then Anthony will give his presentation. And as he is presenting, please do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. And I will start by asking a few questions in the beginning, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But first, special thank you to Anthony Rinna for joining us today. Anthony Rinna is a senior editor with the Sino-NK Scholarly Research Group. His research on Korea-Russia relations has appeared in several scholarly publications, including Asia Policy and the US-Korea Joint Academic Studies. His views have been cited by the Congressional Research Service and in media, including Foreign Policy and the Wall Street Journal. He is proficient in the Russian language and has working knowledge of the Korean language as well. Anthony is a US citizen who has lived in South Korea since 2014. So Anthony, great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming on to share your expertise for what I'm sure will be a great discussion as well. So with that, over to you. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Ross, and thank you, Esther, for kicking everything off. So yeah, I think Ross pretty much covered everything, so I won't spend much time talking about myself, nor will I talk very much about the Soviet period or, a whole lot related to nuclear issues, unless I feel it's absolutely germane to this talk. So the title here, the title of this talk, Fair Weather Friends, I personally actually chose that title because I feel that the North Korea-Russia relationship in the post-Soviet period is, quite transactional. And I think that if we look at it over the past maybe 30, 35 years, we're kind of seeing it's been a very slowly developing relationship. And then we're really, over the past 3 years or so, really seeing kind of a fruition of what the post-Cold War relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang would look like. Now, taking this 35-year period, I would break it down into a couple of sub-periods, and really they really center on a couple of key years. 1988, 1995, the turn of the century, so 2000, 2001, and then 2019, which leads us up to the present. In my initial remarks, I'm not really going to talk very much about, the current issues like the COVID pandemic, which is tapering off, but still, going on. And I'm not really going to talk very much about issues related to Ukraine as far as the North Korea-Russia relationship goes. I'm going to kind of save that, as I think Esther had kind of wanted. I'm going to save that more for the Q&A. So I'm hoping that, maybe some of Ross's questions or some of our audience questions will kind of seg into that. So just to kind of go back to what I was saying, the reason why I chose 1988 as a year is because that was the year that Mikhail Gorbachev, the late Mikhail Gorbachev, I should probably say, made the Krasnoyarsk Declaration. And one of the key lines in the speech that he gave in September of that year was a willingness to develop relations with South Korea. As you may know, at that time, the Soviet Union only had an official bilateral relationship with North Korea. There was some informal, I think, some informal economic relations going on at that time, but not very much in the way of that. And so, you know, this willingness to shore up relations with Seoul, that was actually quite significant for Soviet policy at the time, even, you know, Soviet policies such as Glasnost and some of the reforms that Gorbachev had been trying to implement. And of course, this would have segged quite nicely with then South Korean President Roh Tae-woo's Nordpolitik, although, as you know, we'll see in a few minutes, it didn't quite really work out that way. So 1988, and then the following years, you know, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic and political tumult within Soviet Union / Russia from that period. This combined really led to a downturn in Moscow-Pyongyang relations. From a practical standpoint, you know, North Korea was, of course, divested, I guess you could say, or they lost out on the Soviet subsidies, which of course, you know, impacted Pyongyang quite negatively in that regard. But more than that, I think overall this willingness to kind of reach out to Seoul on a deeper level, this fostered a great deal of mistrust between North Korea and Russia, especially on North Korea's end. And I don't think that they've ever quite fully recovered from that. Where this, from my understanding, is regarded as a mistake on Russia's end is because this is, again, from what I've read and, you know, Russian scholars, their comments on this is regarded as primarily a mistake, is not only did they sort of jettison their relationship with North Korea at that time, but the intent to develop relations with South Korea didn't really reach a very good fruition either, because at that time, you know, the early and mid 90s, there really wasn't a whole lot aside from, you know, what Roh Tae-woo had envisioned in his Nordpolitik. There really wasn't a whole lot that post-Soviet Russia could offer the ROK. So this sort of led to an overall diminishment of Russia's position on the Korean Peninsula, which it actually led to a really interesting state of affairs, which is known as the Russian strategy of equidistance between North Korea and South Korea. The idea being that Moscow tries to keep as balanced relations with Pyongyang and Seoul as possible. In an ideal world, you know, this would mean that that Russia could serve as sort of an intermediary between North Korea and South Korea, be it on related to issues on denuclearization, unification. But in reality, this has actually not really been the case, as I'm sure we know, as rather, you know, the loss of Russian influence on the Korean Peninsula as a result of actions taken during this period from 1988 to about 1995, that just led to an overall, you know, diminishment of Russian influence, and it's never really translated into an ability to act as an intermediary the way that Moscow would hope. Now, the reason why I cite 1995 is not only is this about the time that this equidistance policy or this equidistance strategy came into being, this is also a year that the treaty relationship between North Korea and Russia fundamentally changed. Now, the reason why I say it changed is because there seems to be sort of confusion actually about what actually happened. From what I've read in, you know, several pieces of academic literature, I've read that it was Russia that basically unilaterally withdrew from the 1961 North Korea-Soviet treaty that they had implemented. But from what I understand, actually from, comments that I received from a Russian government official, was that it wasn't that Russia unilaterally withdrew from this treaty, but rather that they merely suggested that, the treaty be revised. So just in your reading or in anybody else's research, if you ever come upon that, just bear that in mind, that, from the word from the horse's mouth seems to contradict what's often, written in the literature. So this is why 1995, I would say, is kind of the year that the dust sort of settled from the tumult emerging from the 1980s. But it really isn't until about the year 2000, 2001 that further developments take place. In 2000, of course, Vladimir Putin visited Pyongyang, and they implemented a new treaty, which one of the interesting things about this treaty is, in contrast to the 1961 treaty, it does not have a clause or any provisions about mutual defense in the case of an attack, which I always thought that was quite interesting. And I personally think that's because at this time, the 90s, early 2000s, with all the tumult going on with the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, I feel like the Kremlin probably thought that it would be too much of a liability to implement something like that in this revised treaty. And then, of course, in 2001, Kim Jong-il visited Russia, where the Moscow Declaration was issued. And one of the really interesting things about the Moscow Declaration is the Moscow Declaration contains language that was also contained in the 1961 treaty, which specifically cites the UN as being sort of a, the basis for the bilateral relationship. They want to, they want the bilateral relationship to function, within the aegis of the UN, within the confines of the UN. And the reason why I find that interesting is because even now, and I'm hoping we'll get into this later, I'm sure we will, is because the UN has also been, has also kind of played a role in the discourse between North Korea and Russia in their bilateral relationship with regards to the way they both approach, the war in Ukraine. So that's also kind of one of these pivotal years, 2-year periods where things, from an official policy perspective, become concretized. But, over the next almost 20 years, there really isn't a whole lot going on in the relationship. I mean, Russia wrote off a significant portion of North Korea's Soviet-era debt. I believe it was the North Korean side, they declared 2015 to be a year of friendship, some high-level exchanges, visits, but it isn't really until 2019 that we start to see something that I think really tells us a lot about the relationship in terms of where it could go in, the near term and in the long term. And I think the year to really watch is 2019. The reason why I cite that year is because that's, of course, the year that the Vladivostok summit took place, when Kim Jong-un met with Vladimir Putin. And I think what's telling about this is, in May of 2018, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, he had visited Pyongyang, and then at the end of his visit, he extended an invitation to Kim Jong-un on Vladimir Putin's part, on his behalf, to visit Russia. Now, this, the actual summit, it didn't occur until almost a year later, which is quite a long time to basically be leaving someone hanging. And as I've kind of pondered this, both at that time in April 2019 and even more recently, what I think what was happening was, because Kim Jong-un, obviously at that time, he had shown his willingness to travel internationally and meet with world leaders, but the fact that it took him so long to meet with Vladimir Putin, that of course shows that he wasn't particularly enthusiastic about meeting him, especially given the number of times that he'd met with Moon Jae-in, Xi Jinping, and of course Donald Trump. So what I think, kind of looking back at the way this is all played out, what I think was going on is I think that Kim Jong-un knew that he couldn't really leave Vladimir Putin hanging for too long, because of course that would be snubbing an important ally. I mean, not technically an ally, but a friend or an ally of sorts. And so I think what Kim wanted to do is he wanted to kind of see where things would go. And after the Hanoi summit in February of 2019, once that didn't really, produce any significant results, I think that Kim Jong-un kind of saw that as a chance to say, okay, now I want to sidle up closer to Russia as much as possible, because I'm going to need, as many people in my corner as possible to help me advance my relations or my interests against the United States. So that's what I think was going on there. And then, of course, in 2020, the pandemic hit, trade pretty much ground to a halt. I mean, just this morning, I read that there was 30 horses of some sort. I forget what breed. They were shipped across the border into North Korea. I read very briefly about that. I couldn't give you any details, but this was like the first rail shipment that I know of in pretty much 3 years. No legislative exchanges. There were, lawmakers, parliamentarians had engaged in visits quite often between both sides, people to people exchanges, and then that had all pretty much evaporated with the pandemic. And then just to kind of, get into very briefly about Ukraine, and then, hopefully we'll go deeper there with the Q&A. North Korea, as I'm sure a lot of the audience members, as I'm sure a lot of has just been unconditional in its support for Russia with what it's been doing. And, to me, this shows a sense that North Korea perceives in Russia a sort of utility, that they see a value in developing relations with Russia in a way that they never quite had during times such as, say the six-party talks. I mean, Russia joined the six-party talks, more or less at North Korea's behest, but at the same time, there hasn't been a lot of inherent value for Pyongyang in and of itself in terms of its relationship with Russia until relatively recently. So those are kind of the main points looking at the post-Soviet relationship that I would leave the audience with. Ross, if you want to go ahead and could jump into some questions or anything else you might want to add, by any chance.
Anthony, happy to. Thank you very much for that broad overview of the bilateral relationship. And I'd like to pick up and follow your lead, actually, when you mentioned how that bilateral relationship is played out with respect to the United Nations. Mm-hmm. So, in that period from 2000 to up to 2019, there and beyond, there have been a whole series of UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea in response to their provocations that Russia has supported during that time. Mm-hmm. So you describe that period as a relatively cooled off period in the bilateral relationship up until the last few years. But there were striking moments when Russia sided with the international community against North Korea in response to their nuclear tests, their missile tests. So could you speak to that and how that dynamic is played out with, as you said, North Korea wanting Russia to be in the six-party talks in these multilateral fora? So how these multilateral dimensions affected the bilateral relationship?
Okay. Well, I think from Russia's end, the ultimate reason why they've supported sanctions against North Korea is because, at the end of the day, Russia wants to be seen as a responsible member of the international community. And, what's so telling about this, I think, is, well over 2 months, I think about 2 months actually into the, I'll call it the full-scale invasion of Ukraine from February. There was one highly placed government official. I can't remember if he was from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or if he was from the Kremlin, but basically he had said, and I quote, "As a responsible member of the international community, Russia continues to support sanctions against North Korea." Now, this is at a time when I think by that time, Russia had literally become more heavily sanctioned than North Korea itself. So I think that, Russia's position towards North Korea has more or less been based on, this is more or less a red line that we are not willing to cross. No matter what we might do in other parts of our periphery, explicit support for North Korea, explicit friendship in direct contravention of international norms is not something that we're willing to do. Personally, I think that could change. I'm seeing little hints here and there that could change, although I don't want to jump to any conclusions without, substantial evidence. So yeah, I think that right there, this desire to be seen as a responsible player, a responsible member, I think that's sort of trumped, if you will, the bilateral relationship, especially because when you look at Russian strategy and what areas, because remember, North Korea is on the Russian periphery, and it is I don't know if you could say it's the weak underbelly of Russia. I think that's more of a term that's used for Central Asia adjacent to, say, Afghanistan, but it is definitely a weak link or a vulnerable part of the Russian periphery, but it's still not quite as important as, other parts of the periphery, in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So I don't think that it's something where they feel that a relationship with North Korea in and of itself, a strong relationship, would have very much merit if it, in fact meant that it would become even more of a pariah state than it was up until, February of this year.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting to hear that you believe Russia would favor its international standing over its bilateral relationship with North Korea. And at the same time, North Korea is taking a rather pragmatic view, it seems, of its relationship with Russia openly. Pyongyang's describing the relationship as, quote, tactical and strategic collaboration. That's not the language of communist camaraderie. It seems quite targeted and placed. And the context is very specific there, and I'm sure they put a great deal of effort into that framing. So with that in mind, I know you don't want to go too much into projections into the future, but are you seeing North Korea's actions with support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine purely as trying to pull Russia away from the support they've been giving to the international community in sanctions and trying to pry Russia more onto the side of being, say, part of the anti-Western bloc?
I definitely think that's part of it. But conversely, I also think that Russia may, regardless of whatever efforts to that end North Korea makes, I also think that Russia could end up, viewing North Korea as, a true, or I shouldn't say a true friend, but I think that Russia may end up seeing greater value in a stronger relationship with North Korea, precisely because North Korea is one of the few states that's been so openly supportive of Russia. And the reason why I say that is because, in and of itself, North Korea can't really offer Russia very much. But at the same time, I think that Russia will seek friends. And let me also say that I would be careful about exaggerating the extent to which Russia has been isolated, because there was, from what I saw, there was, I didn't see it, but from what I've read, there was a fairly decent turnout at this year's Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. But at the same time, given the degree to which North Korea has been so unabashed in its support for Russia, I think that especially in terms of Russia's own strategy towards the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, or Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it, they may see the relationship with North Korea as being beneficial, especially if this means sort of undermining US influence in this part of Russia's periphery. So basically, it's not exclusively because of North Korea's own efforts, but also circumstantially, further alienation from the West than they've experienced even since 2014, when they annexed Crimea, which is sort of cited as the year that their so-called pivot to the east really took off. I mean, some people would dispute that. Some would say that it, really began a couple years before that, but I think circumstantially that could also help push the relationship closer.
Thank you. And there's a question in the chat from J.U. Park, who wants to know specifically, if North Korea conducts its 7th nuclear test, will Russia not join a UN resolution?
Yeah, I'm inclined to say, well, I'm inclined to say no. But there again, we've gotten word that, my understanding is that China, could condemn this. It really, I get the sense not. But if Russia did, I would say that it would go back to being, getting back to this idea of wanting to be seen as a responsible member of the international community. So maybe I should probably walk that back. Actually, I apologize. I think they might. There's a decent chance that they would, but if they were to, it would be because they would want to try to restore some degree of goodwill, or not be seen as having gone way off the deep end to the point that they're willing to support this level of provocation on North Korea's part. But at the same time, I guess I should say, getting back to my original sort of knee-jerk reaction, that we shouldn't be entirely surprised if they didn't, simply because they may not see as much incentive in this. And especially, and I'm not just saying that, to be entirely speculative. What I have seen from a reaction to the amendment of North Korea's own nuclear law about, first strike, the reaction in Russia, both in the policy community and among academics, seems to have just been, it is what it is. They have this deterrent. They have it more or less because of the United States. So it's possible that in the event of a 7th nuclear test, that attitude may manifest itself again. So I better walk back my initial reaction and say there's a very good chance of yes, there's a very good chance no. And these are my reasons for for thinking that. But whether or not I think that they will or not, that's I probably shouldn't answer definitive yes or no.
Fair enough. And I see there are some questions about the invasion of Ukraine coming up. But staying on this topic, there's a comment from Georgie Tolaroya, who says the Good Neighborhood Treaty was signed by 4 ministries in February 2000. Putin and Kim Jong-il signed 2 resolutions. North Koreans attach greater importance to them than the treaty. So there's that comment. And now I'd like to turn to a comments and a question from our partner Esther Inn at the National Committee on North Korea. She says, the Russian embassy has been interestingly candid about their departure from Pyongyang, famously posting the picture of its staff leaving on a push-pull trolley from the border, which seemed very critical. Do you think with improved relations, Moscow will be able to re-enter the country more quickly than other diplomatic missions?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Dr. Tolaraya for that comment. And especially because I do think it was the Moscow, as I probably mentioned before, it was the Moscow Declaration that contained language similar to the treaty, but I actually was not aware of that they placed greater emphasis on that declaration. So many thanks for that. I imagine they probably would. To answer Esther's question, so the trolley thing, and I just want to say, I wouldn't read too much into that. That was only, I think, the last kilometer or last couple of kilometers, because journalists did ask me about that. And I think, and what I told them at the time was that doesn't look real good, but I think there's a risk of kind of fetishizing that image. But to answer your question about the diplomatic mission, yes, I definitely think so, because this sort of bleeding out of embassy staff, this has really, I think it's kind of placed the diplomatic aspect of the relationship in a kind of a lopsided manner, especially at times when when the country's gone into lockdown over the past couple of years. I know Ambassador Matsugora, at least at one point, was quite candid about that. The difficulties in getting out, getting out and talking to people and just interacting. I think that's really pushed a lot of the diplomatic interaction over to over into Moscow's end. I believe North Korea's ambassador to Russia, Shin Hong-chul, I think he meets with officials it seems to be he meets with Russian officials every couple of months, just looking at the Russian Foreign Ministry's website, senior diplomats, etc. So I think a lot of the in-person, face-to-face interaction has kind of been focused more heavily on Moscow. I'm sure Ambassador Matsugora, he's probably been able to get out a little bit more, although especially with the outbreak of COVID in North Korea, that's probably put a damper on things. But yeah, I would definitely think that that's something that they're going to want to try to do, not only diplomatic personnel, but also staff from companies such as Rasonkontrans, the joint North Korea-Russia logistics company, transport company, and especially with this shipment of horses, is kind of the first sign that trade will be reviving, which is something they've hinted at for a while now. I think that's also something that they're going to want to, try to pick up on.
I also saw that piece of news about the first train travel across the border since 2019. It was in the Moscow Times. They reported that 30 thoroughbred Russian horses had been sent to North Korea, and that between 2010 and 2019, 138 horses had been sent to North Korea, which cost almost $600,000 in total. So it's not a small part of their trade. I'll get back to Ukraine in a moment, but I want to go to a Q&A, a question from Darcy Drought. She likes your periodization of the bilateral relationship, and she says, zooming out on a bit of the bigger picture, what's the role of ideological ties in the 90s between North Korea after the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And how would you balance the question of ideology versus the pragmatism that we discussed earlier in an interest-based relationship during that period?
Okay. I've never really given much consideration to there being much of an ideological aspect to the relationship in the 90s. I think it was just, with all the tumult going on in Russia at that time, especially with things such as, shock therapy, the lifting of price controls and things like that. I just don't really see a lot of, much in the way of ideology in that regard. And then there was a second part of that question, Ross. Would you mind reiterating that?
How would you balance the question of ideology versus pragmatism during that interest-based period of the relationship?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say that it's been very much more on the pragmatic side. And even, in the ideological sense, even during the Soviet period, I've always kind of gotten the sense that this has been, especially from the Soviet end of things, that ideologies, common ideologies sort of been kind of a cloak for the practical side of things. And, the reason why I say this is because, as I mentioned earlier, North Korea, of course, being part of the Russian periphery, if you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, North Korea in particular, and really the Korean Peninsula as a whole, falls on this, what Nicholas Speakman would call the rimland. times. And one sort of interesting aspect of this that I found reading some old academic papers from some of the US military colleges in the 80s is this sense that North Korea in particular, when you think about it, things in terms of the rimlands, that North Korea sort of represents this, is part of the Soviet rimlands that they never really were able to project much power. And so I think that in the Soviet Union's strategic competition with the United States, North Korea, in a very practical sense, going back even to the days of the Russian Empire, when the Russian Empire and the British Empire, even as part of the Great Game, had some competition going on over Korea, and then later on with the Russian and Japanese empires. I think even in that regard, that was really any sort of ideological camaraderie between the two states, between North Korea and Russia. I think especially from the Russian end, this was probably more geopolitical in nature under the veil of ideology in the context of the Cold War.
That's great, thank you. And to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been several different reports on ties between Russia and North Korea with respect to that invasion. There was some say a rumor that the North Koreans would send 100,000 troops to support the Russians in Ukraine, something which the Russians and the North Koreans have both denied. And there was a report from American intelligence that the Russians are buying millions of artillery shells and ammunition from the North Koreans, also something that the North Koreans and Russians have denied. So could you speak to recent activities between Russia and North Korea with respect to the invasion and your take on these reports? Okay.
Yeah, so the thing about the troops, so I think the person that said that, I don't recall their name, but I think they said that on one of the state affiliated channels. I think it was a pundit that had said that. I don't really know where this number 100,000 would come from or what sort of basis this was. Now, what I can say about the possibility of North Korean troops in Ukraine is, I think I've read this in a couple of times in Radio Free Asia. It could have been the Daily NK. It was one of those two outlets, but I'm pretty sure it was Radio Free Asia. I've read reports that there are active duty North Korean troops in Russia as laborers. And if I recall correctly, I think they even sort of undergo this sort of identity processing where they're basically given new civilian identities and they're in Russia, and then they're doing, like forestry labor or construction labor. I mean, again, these are reports based on people on the ground. I'm not there, so I couldn't tell you, absolutely definitively. Now, and then I think what I did read about a month ago or so is the possibility that these North Korean troops that are supposedly in Russia as laborers, that they could be dispatched, they could be part of this, these plans to dispatch North Korean workers to the Donbass. That's really the only plausible thing I could really speak to with the possibility of, troops, technically speaking, in Ukraine, but the idea that 100,000, armed and uniformed KPA soldiers fighting in, Zaporizhia or something like that, that's a little far out there for me. The weapons thing. So what's interesting about that is, so the intelligence reports, this sounded like artillery, but actually one thing that I had read was someone was talking about how North Korean equipment that they have, because people think, well, why, excuse me, why would Russia want to buy, equipment from North Korea? I mean, it's not particularly high quality. And what one analyst, he was either a Russian or Belarusian, I can't remember which, but he was talking about how this, North Korean equipment, it may not be, excuse me, it may not be quite as high precision, but that might actually be more effective on the battlefield in Russia's favor. Now again, I'm not saying that this is actually what's going on. I'm just saying that I'm just kind of reiterating what somebody else had said. So there is a possibility there could be some benefit to this, but whether or not they're actually doing this, again, I'm not in the intelligence community. I don't know quite what they're basing this on, but if there is any truth to these to these reports, then that is something to think about. It may not be quite as far-fetched as it could seem, but at the same time, again, I don't want to I just, and anything of this nature, I always hesitate to comment on, because I know it's of a sensitive nature, and I'm not privy to things. So
I do remember the Radio Free Asia coverage of the construction workers in Russia. They're reporting that there have been so many escapes by North Korean workers in Russia, both laborers and management, that they had to put a significant part of the operation on hold to investigate the North Koreans escaping. And they were escaping because they'd heard reports they'd be sent to the Donbass. And
yes.
And on that, also on that note, I can't remember which Russian official it was, but he was saying political arrangements were being made between Russia and North Korea to have potentially tens of thousands of North Korean laborers helping with infrastructure in the Russian Far East. So speaking to this economic relationship and North Korea's history of forced labor and Russia enabling that forced labor, could you speak to how Russia will rely on North Korea in future, maybe to further their economic livelihood at this point? I think I read that the sanctions, international sanctions against the Russians, have been very effective in the immediate term of affecting Russia's weapons and the electronics that go into their weaponry. But the longer term effects of the sanctions against Russia's economy will be more visible in the near to later future. So going back to Russia, North Korea, could you speak to this economic piece in the relationship, and how, as Russia is sanctioned by the international community, how might they become closer in this very pragmatic way with the North Koreans?
Yeah, it's hard to say where that could go, because I don't really see much value added for either Russia or North Korea, really, unless unless China can somehow step in there and give them some breathing space. To North Korea's benefit, Russian fuel could definitely be useful, because and again, I can't remember who it was, if it was the Russian top diplomat for East Asia or who it was, but somebody said that they getting ready to resume oil exports to North Korea, just as part of the the overall revival in trade, which again is pretty much reviving from nothing. That would of course be very beneficial to North Korea, and especially when we're talking about sanctions. As I'm sure many of us know, there's a limit to the amount of energy that Russia is allowed to export to North Korea. Now, whether or not Russia, might be willing to go in excess of that or not, that's that's something to consider. So that's definitely one way that North Korea could benefit from the economic relationship. How Russia could benefit, I really think it would only be in case, China could somehow get in there and facilitate things. For the longest time, the idea was that, North Korea, Russia, and South Korea would manage to collaborate. I mean, there's been talk for 20, 25 years, if not longer, about a trans-Korean pipeline, which, you know, I mean, even before all this, that was not something I think anybody really took that seriously as a real prospect. And otherwise, things such as Moon Jae-in's I got it on the tip of my tongue. I don't know if you could help me out. The not the new Northern policy, the nine bridges and yeah, but anyway, you know, Moon Jae-in had a policy that he wanted to try to, you know, shore up trilateral relations with Russia, North Korea, and South Korea. And then, of course, you know, even during Moon Jae-in's you know, administration, the era of summit diplomacy and things like that, that never really took off very much. And now I don't see any real prospect for that at all. So that's yeah. So without South Korea, the only other thing that could really facilitate that would be China, whether it be through, you know, providing a sort of a loophole for them, you know, to evade sanctions or something like that. But, you know, otherwise, yeah, it's hard to say what real value or what real benefit, concrete benefits they could realize.
Well, I'm glad you raised China, because there is another comment and question in the Q&A, also from Darcy Drought, about China's equities and implications of China's involvement. So let me read it out for you. When many analysts or scholars talk revisionist states, we focus on Russia and Europe, and China potentially or imminently in the Asia Pacific. Maybe we neglect conversation of Russia's concerns in its Far East, especially island chains that run up pretty close to North Korea. Does Pyongyang see this as threatening? How much might these be affecting the bilateral relationship in this current third period? And I'll add to that North Korea has a history of trying to balance Russia and China. So adding to the mix of these issues, would China be concerned about the extent to which Russia will be reliant on North Korea, or North Korea will look to Russia more and more for cash flows?
I don't think there would be any real concern as long as Russia continues to recognize North Korea as basically being within China's sphere of influence. Now, having said that, there's always been sort of a mutual understanding between China and Russia, you know, well before the events, you know, the war in Ukraine, or I should say the large-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, there's been a war for 8 years at least, but you know, the idea has always been that China recognizes Ukraine as more or less being in Russia's sphere of influence, and then in turn, Russia more or less recognizes North Korea as being in China's sphere of influence. And as such, you know, Russia had never really had that much of a problem of China sinking investments into Ukraine, as long as they, you know, recognize that this is still part of Moscow's sphere. And then conversely, sort of in return, Russia was always kind of expected to, you know, recognize North Korea as being in that regard. Now, with things, you know, to put it politely, to put it very lightly, up in the air with, you know, Ukraine's status, that could change if, you know, for example, there is no longer a quid pro quo. You know, if Russia can't say, okay, China, you recognize this, and then in return, we'll recognize North Korea as being, you know, indisputably in your sphere of influence, and then just let us, you know, play around here and there. So that would be something to watch, especially as, you know, as we watch how things in Ukraine unfold. And then as far as the neglect of Russia's interests in the Far East, the Russian Far East being the region of Russia, that being the official name of it, the Russian Far East. I think that overall there's really, it's not even just the fact that there's a tendency to neglect Russia's interests. I think there really is a tendency to not consider Russia to be much of a player at all. This goes back to, things such as Russia's participation in the six-party talks, which was sort of really, as I understand it, was really, sort of to balance out Japan's participation. And then, of course, when, you look at the Panmunjom Declaration in, I think it was 2018, Russia was not included in that. And that, that smarted, they weren't too pleased about that. And one thing I'll say is, just to kind of get, to take this a little further, I do think that one thing that policymakers in the US and in South Korea and other stakeholder countries are going to have to watch out for, and this is something I've been hitting home really in my longer academic papers over the past couple of years, is I really think that the Russia, and again, to use Darcy's citation of the revisionist and rogue states, the US government tends to cite Russia as being a revisionist power primarily in Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet space. However, I think that things on the Korean Peninsula, developments on the Korean Peninsula, even before Russia invaded Ukraine, in this massive way in 2022, I've long felt that the Korean Peninsula could be sort of the term I've once used in a paper was a lightning rod for Russia-US geopolitical tensions in the western part of Eurasia. I've always thought that those could potentially, be magnetically pulled toward the Korean Peninsula. And I think even more so now with, Pyongyang's basically unconditional support for Russia. So that's something that we will also have to, kind of keep an eye on. And of course, how this would factor in with China, that is something to watch, because again, Russia doesn't want to step on China's toes. So would Russia coordinate things with China in terms of Korean security, or the extent to which the Korean Peninsula plays a role in Russia-US strategic tensions? Those are things to consider. But, overall, I definitely think that policymakers sort of neglect this potential for Russia-US tensions to spill over into East Asia. I think that neglecting that would be a mistake, to say the least.
Right, thank you. So you're a Russian linguist, and you've spoken with Russian officials. And in your research, could you share an anecdote, maybe something that surprised you about the way the Russians think about North Korea? Or is there some example you can give of how Russian officials characterize their relationship with the North Koreans over the years?
Okay, well, yeah. So if you want to, for an anecdote, so I'm not quite as active on social media as I used to be, but I did notice some years ago about the anniversary of I think it was the Hiroshima bombing. I think it was specifically August 7th. The Russian embassy in North Korea, they had posted something on their Facebook page about that. And I was honestly a little surprised, because that Facebook page has always been pretty strictly about the North Korea-Russia bilateral relationship. And I was kind of surprised to see them talking about an event that happened in Japan. And I admit I wasn't rude, and I don't think I was anyway, but I did ask. I said, hey, what's up with this? Why are you, posting this on here? This occurred in Japan. This is an issue between Japan and the United States. And I had actually got a personal response from the Russian ambassador on his personal Facebook account. And he said, a lot of Koreans died in this, in the atomic bombings. And that was something I'd never really thought about. I said, okay. And then that's also and I took it for what it was. I said, okay. And then I had also heard, from other, journalists who had uncovered this, that's sort of the part of their narrative, is that what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's also kind of part of the, I wouldn't say it's part of the bilateral relationship, but it adds a little bit of context to that. So, excuse me. I think what it kind of says about the relationship is, I think Russia kind of sees, they see some roots of the Russia-US strategic competition in this part of the world. They see a degree of historic depth that really is kind of lost on Americans today. Because again, I was also talking to Alistair Gale on Twitter. He had mentioned something about there being there was like a flower laying ceremony or something, a Russian diplomat or some official kind of paid their respects to the Hiroshima bombings, and they had cited that exact same thing. It was because so many ethnic Koreans had died in that, and there could be an element of kind of trying to stick it to the U.S. in that regard, especially because sometimes this notion that the U.S. has used, especially with these sort of insinuations Vladimir Putin has been making about the potential for a nuclear attack in Ukraine. This is something that's occurred in that discourse. People have said, the U.S. has used weapons of mass destruction. The subtext being, what's why can't we? So that's I guess if you were looking for anecdotal evidence or some more personal interaction, that's probably the first example that comes to mind.
Thank you. And we're coming towards the end of our time, but one final question for you is what should we watch out for on the horizon? We've mentioned some of these items already. And what sources could we go to track and pay attention to the Russia-North Korea relationship?
So I think the biggest thing to watch out for, aside from Russia's reaction to any potential seventh nuclear test, it'll be the degree to which Russia complies with sanctions or does not. Russia has always been very adamant that they've maintained compliance, that they've abided by sanctions. Of course, there have been various intelligence reports over the years to the contrary, but this is still something that they're very adamant about, very determined to that people perceive at the very least. What has been interesting is I believe it was the Russian deputy prime minister, Mishustin. He has been talking more openly lately about the possibility of hiring North Korean workers, which of course would be a clear violation of UN sanction. I think it was resolution 2397. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what it was. And then so he's made a couple of comments about that since I think August. And then in late September or maybe early October, a parliamentary committee of I don't think it was the United Russia Party, which is Putin's party. I think it was a smaller party. They basically made an inquiry to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to look into the legality or the possibility of hiring workers in Russia, North Korean workers in Russia. The wording was we just want to look into this and how this, what the implications for, legal compliance. But the fact that these discussions are being had, I think that that's something to watch out for, because it means, okay, we're at least willing, we're going from, okay, they're pretty much out of the country, aside from a few stragglers that got left behind because there were no trains or, not enough planes or the border closure. It's gone from that to a more explicit willingness to say, hey, let's look into this. So there's that. And as I mentioned, I think it was Georgy Zinoviev who mentioned that the possibility of resuming oil sales to Russia. It may have been Igor Morgulov, the top diplomat for Russia's Asian affairs. What sort of sanctions compliance or non-compliance could occur with regards to workers, energy sales, things of that nature. I would say that's probably the biggest thing to watch out for.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And while you were sharing this, Ian Story of ICES Singapore shared some breaking news in the Q&A that we can turn to afterwards. Live, ongoing, very important issues in this relationship. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise with us and to answer the questions of our audience. And thank you again to the National Committee on North Korea for this partnership. Thank you to everyone who's joined us and shared your questions and your insights and your expertise as well. And stay tuned for future installments of the series. And please do, if you're interested, look back at previous webinars with other guest speakers. And once again, thank you very much to everyone, and have a good day.
Yes, thank you, Ross. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thank you for your engaging questions.
Thank you.